Imagine total darkness. You cannot move a single muscle. You cannot take a full breath. Right above your head, separated by just a few centimeters of thin wooden boards, are the heavy leather boots of armed soldiers. You have been buried alive in this suffocating darkness for 47 hours. There are still 25 agonizing hours left to go. One tiny cough, one involuntary shiver, one sudden breath of panic, and your life is instantly over. If a single German shepherd dog catches your scent through these planks, they will tear you apart before the soldiers even have to pull the trigger. This is not some suspenseful Hollywood movie script designed to thrill you on a Friday night. This is the brutal, unforgiving reality of April 1944. This is Auschwitz. At this very moment, 200 highly trained attack dogs are unleashed. The entire camp perimeter is on maximum high alert. The sirens are screaming, shattering the silence of the Polish night. Thousands of heavily armed SS soldiers are frantically scouring every inch of the complex, hunting for two escaped fugitives. But what they do not know is that Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler are lying right beneath their boots. These two young men have not run away. They are hiding inside the compound, buried under a massive pile of timber. They have found a bug in the system. They discovered a fatal flaw within a flawless machine of mass destruction. It is a deadly 72-hour window that gives them a ghost of a chance to survive. This is not a story about escaping just to save their own skin. This is a story about two men who decided to break a system to save hundreds of thousands of lives. And this is exactly how they executed the most impossible prison break in human history. Auschwitz was never designed to be a prison. It was a factory. It was a highly efficient, meticulously engineered conveyor belt designed for one single, terrifying purpose: to liquidate human beings with maximum industrial efficiency. And like any massive industrial factory, it required workers to sort the incoming materials. Every single day, the trains arrived endlessly. Long, dark cattle cars packed tightly with terrified families. These people were systematically lied to. They were told by the authorities that they were simply being resettled to the east for a new life. Mothers comforted their crying children, promising them that they would soon have a warm bed and a garden to play in. The elderly, the sick, the young children, and anyone who looked too weak for hard labor were immediately separated upon arrival. They were pointed towards large concrete buildings with signs that bore a simple, reassuring word: showers. They went there willingly. They went with hope in their hearts, eager to wash off the dust of their grueling journey. That shower room became their final, horrifying stop. The rest of the arrivals, those deemed fit enough to work, were violently stripped of their identities. They were tattooed with a cold blue number on their skin and condemned to brutal slavery until their bodies completely gave out from exhaustion. Rudolf Vrba arrived in this man-made hell in June 1942. He was only 17 years old. He was just an ordinary, frightened teenage boy from Slovakia who was suddenly forced to become a cog in this colossal machine of death. His assigned job was not manual labor in the quarries. His job was arguably much more psychologically devastating. He was ordered to sort through the personal belongings of the deceased. Every day, he stood amidst mountains of stolen property. He sorted through thousands of battered suitcases. He picked through piles of golden wedding rings, reading the engraved names of people who had just been turned to ash. He touched discarded children's toys, family photographs, and winter coats. He saw the endless arrival of the trains. He witnessed the brutal selection process on the ramp. He watched thousands of innocent people walking calmly toward their end, completely unaware that they had only minutes left to live. But Rudolf did not just watch with numb submission. He did something incredibly dangerous. He counted. He memorized every detail. He kept a meticulous, horrifying ledger inside his head. Because the guards strictly prohibited any written records of the true scale of their operation, Rudolf's brain became the only archive of the apocalypse. By 1944, the figure he held in his mind was absolutely staggering: 1,750,000 victims. And the outside world knew absolutely nothing about it. That was the dark secret behind the system's terrifying success. Secrecy and deception. No one outside those electrified fences knew the sheer, industrial scale of the slaughter. Rudolf realized a fundamental truth. The greatest weapon the enemy possessed was not their guns, their guard towers, or their dogs. Their greatest weapon was the ignorance of the victims and the silence of the world. He knew that if the truth could somehow break free, if the world could see the numbers he had memorized, it could disrupt the entire operation. It could save hundreds of thousands of lives. But this truth was locked behind layers of barbed wire, high-voltage fences, machine gun nests, and hundreds of ruthless guards. No one had ever successfully escaped from the main camp to tell the world the truth and live to see it published. Every previous attempt had ended in public, agonizing execution as a warning to the rest. But Rudolf was no longer just a frightened 17-year-old boy. He was a survivor who had spent 2 years studying the architecture of his own tomb, and he was about to weaponize his knowledge. You cannot escape a fortress of this magnitude, unless you understand its intricate architecture better than the men who built it. Rudolf Vrba did not plan this impossible mission alone. He found a partner in Alfred Wetzler. Alfred was a 26-year-old man, also a Slovak, and also condemned for being born Jewish, in a place where trust could literally cost you your life. These two men possessed what most others lacked: absolute, unwavering trust in one another. Together, they spent months secretly studying every single failed escape attempt that had occurred before them. There were dozens of desperate bids for freedom, and every single one ended in the exact same brutal fashion. The fugitives were caught, tortured, and publicly executed as a terrifying deterrent to the remaining prisoners. But Rudolf and Alfred observed something that no one else in the camp had noticed. They studied the system itself, and like every complex, rigid system, it possessed a critical, structural weak point waiting to be exploited. They began to analyze the security perimeter of the Auschwitz complex. It was not just a single wall. The camp was heavily fortified by 2 distinct, formidable perimeters of encirclement. There was an inner fence of high-voltage barbed wire and a much wider, heavily patrolled outer ring of guard towers. During the daylight hours, the prisoners were marched out to work in the designated zone between these 2 fences, constantly watched by the SS. But as night fell, the routine changed drastically. Everyone was marched back inside the inner circle, and the heavy gates were securely locked until morning. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. When a prisoner was reported missing during the evening head count, a terrifying lockdown protocol immediately commenced. A grueling roll call was held in the freezing cold until the exact name of the missing fugitive was identified. And then, the massive hunt began. The sirens wailed, 200 vicious dogs were unleashed, and hundreds of heavily armed soldiers flooded the complex. But Rudolf and Alfred had noticed a crucial detail about this terrifying manhunt. It lasted for exactly 72 hours. Not a day more, not an hour less. Why precisely 72 hours? The cold, calculating Nazi logic was surprisingly simple. The commanders firmly believed that after 3 days on the run, a fugitive would have either died from the elements or traveled far beyond the immediate vicinity of the camp. After 3 days, maintaining the massive outer perimeter was deemed a waste of resources. The patrols were urgently needed on the front lines of the war. Therefore, after exactly 3 days, the massive outer perimeter of guards was completely withdrawn. The manhunt was officially called off. And in this rigid bureaucratic procedure, Rudolf Vrba saw an unbelievable opportunity. What if you do not run at all? What if, instead of desperately fleeing towards the distant horizon, you simply hide right under their noses? What if you stay exactly where you are, wait patiently until the guards pack up and leave, and then calmly walk out of the front gate? It was an idea born of pure madness. It was also undeniably brilliant, but executing this plan meant choosing to spend 3 full days trapped inside the most heavily guarded, terrifying hell on earth, while the entire camp was aggressively searching for you. The Nazis had not lost a single prisoner from the main compound yet. Could 2 young men truly become the first fatal error in their perfect, deadly equation? The core concept of the plan was deceptively simple. Hide in plain sight for 72 hours, survive the intense scrutiny of the search, and then walk to freedom when the coast is clear. But this raised an immediate, terrifying question. Where on earth can you possibly hide in a death factory, where every square inch is monitored? The vast space between the inner and outer fences was mostly bare, exposed earth. There were no natural hiding places, no dense forests to disappear into. Attempting to dig a tunnel underground was absolutely impossible, due to the sheer scale of the operation and the constant surveillance. However, in a newly designated sector of the camp known as Mexico, a massive construction project was currently underway. The Nazis were frantically building a massive extension to the camp. They were preparing to receive a huge influx of deportees, hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews whose arrival was scheduled for the upcoming month of May. This chaotic construction site was heavily littered with raw building materials. Among the scattered debris, Rudolf had heard a faint, persistent rumor. A few weeks prior, 4 desperate prisoners had attempted to escape. Using a massive, hollowed-out woodpile left near the construction zone, They had managed to carve out a small crawl space deep inside the timber, climbed in, and convinced their fellow prisoners to pile heavy boards over them to conceal the entrance. Miraculously, their desperate plan had actually worked. They survived the intense manhunt. They endured the full 72 hours buried alive under the wood. But they made a fatal error later in their journey and were recaptured. They were brought back to the camp and executed. However, their tragic failure proved one crucial, vital detail to Rudolf. The hiding place itself was fundamentally sound. The dogs did not pick up their scent. The guards had walked right past their wooden grave for 3 days without noticing a thing. For those 72 hours, the 4 men were effectively ghosts. They had died only because of mistakes made after leaving the camp. Rudolf discreetly located that very same pile of timber in the Mexico sector. He managed to crawl inside to inspect it. The darkness was absolute. It was an incredibly cramped, terrifying space where 2 adult bodies could only fit. If they were pressed tightly together, chest to chest, and there, etched faintly into the rough wood, he saw a final, defiant message left by his predecessors. They had scratched a blunt insult directed at the Nazis, knowing they would likely die. The hideout was indeed ready and waiting for them, but a massive, seemingly insurmountable problem remained. 200 aggressive, highly trained German shepherds, explicitly trained to violently hunt fugitives down. Rudolf could easily deceive the soldiers, and he could certainly deceive the rigid Nazi system. But how exactly do you trick a dog's incredible sense of smell? These were not ordinary dogs. These were 200 German shepherds bred specifically to become manhunting machines. They were expertly trained to scent pure fear, sweat, and human odor through thick concrete, solid wood, and heavy steel doors. As soon as a prisoner mysteriously vanished during roll call, these dogs were immediately unleashed into the compound. A person hidden inside a pile of raw timber would inevitably be found, in a matter of terrifying minutes, before they even realized what was happening. In order for this insane plan to work, Rudolf desperately needed to become completely invisible. Not invisible to human eyes, which were easily fooled by the wood, but completely invisible to those incredibly sensitive noses. The life-saving answer did not come from a brilliant scientist, but from a desperate group of Soviet prisoners of war. The Russians had been suffering in Auschwitz from the very beginning of its existence. They had grimly witnessed dozens of brutal failed escapes. Crucially, they knew precisely what tactics worked and what deadly mistakes led directly to the gallows. And it was one of these hardened Soviet prisoners who quietly revealed the ultimate secret to survival against the canine threat. He explained that a tracking dog follows a microscopic trail of scent particles suspended in the air. But there are specific, harsh scents that do far more than just confuse the animal. They literally burn out their delicate olfactory receptors. They effectively and violently blind the dog's nose, sending them reeling in agony. And the absolute best remedy for this specific problem? A potent mixture of strong Mahorka tobacco soaked heavily in gasoline. For grueling weeks on end, Rudolf and Alfred meticulously gathered the dangerous ingredients. They scrounged for strong Russian tobacco, risking severe punishment. To collect it, pinch by agonizingly small pinch from the debris of the camp, they secretly soaked the strong tobacco leaves in whatever gasoline they could steal from the motor pool. They carefully dried the volatile mixture and hid it in a secure location until they had enough. By the time April arrived, they had managed to accumulate enough of this toxic substance to theoretically build an invisible wall. It was a wall composed of harsh, acidic chemical fog that was intended to become their only shield against the German shepherds. The meticulous plan was finally ready. Rudolf and Alfred had desperately tried to anticipate every single variable. They had studied every detail, but they both knew there remained one crucial, terrifying variable that was absolutely impossible to calculate beforehand. It was the one element entirely capable of turning a brilliantly conceived plan into a horrifying one-way ticket to a brutal execution. When you are finally lying in that pitch-black, tomb-like darkness, when you can clearly hear the vicious dogs furiously scratching the wooden boards mere centimeters from your face, when you can clearly hear the heavily armed guards casually arguing just outside about whether to simply blow this entire shelter to hell, will you actually be able to stay completely silent? Will your frayed nerves hold out under that unimaginable pressure? Or will you inevitably scream out in sheer panic, instantly giving yourself away just a single second before your rescue? This was the ultimate, terrifying psychological test. Rudolf was barely 19 years old. Alfred was 26. They had already spent nearly 2 unimaginable years surviving in hell. They both knew with absolute certainty that this very day could easily be their last on Earth. In the catastrophic event of their capture, they faced the inevitable end of a public, agonizing death. However, in the miraculous event of their success, they also knew that a brutal Nazi vengeance would immediately fall upon the entire barracks. A collective, devastating death sentence for the brave actions of just two young men. But they also knew something else of far greater, horrifying importance. The terrifying clock was rapidly ticking down. In just a few short weeks, the Nazis were preparing to launch the massive conveyor belt of death for the Hungarian Jews. Hundreds of thousands of completely innocent people who had absolutely no suspicion whatsoever that they were blindly traveling straight into a massive slaughterhouse. The sheer scale of the impending massacre was unimaginable to the outside world. If Rudolf and Alfred could somehow manage to break out of this fortress, if they could just live long enough to tell the free world exactly what was happening here, behind these fences, they could potentially save millions of innocent lives. The terrifying risk to their own lives was suddenly worth taking. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, on a seemingly ordinary day, they finally made their move. They were wearing ordinary civilian suits that had been secretly and incredibly dangerously smuggled into the camp by the organized underground resistance. They knew that if they miraculously made it past the heavily guarded outer gates, they absolutely must look like ordinary working men on the street, not like the emaciated, tattooed shadows from a notorious concentration camp. They walked at a steady, deliberate pace directly toward that very specific woodpile, located deep within the chaotic Mexico sector. Their closest friends, the very few individuals who could be entirely trusted with their lives, began to intentionally distract the heavily armed guards. Risking their own lives by doing so, they loudly drew the suspicious eyes of the SS soldiers in the opposite direction. With the guards momentarily distracted, Rudolf quickly slid into the cramped, dark niche first. Alfred immediately followed him into the abyss. Their incredibly brave friends hastily sealed the narrow entrance with heavy wooden boards, piling them up layer by layer until the hole vanished. And then, as the final, crucial step, they thickly scattered the potent, life-saving mixture of strong tobacco and gasoline all over the surrounding area. They could have easily climbed into that narrow gap themselves and tried to escape. Instead, they willingly walled in their comrades and just walked away, back to the barracks, back into the extreme danger zone, to a place they might never leave alive. They deliberately chose to stay behind so that Rudolf and Alfred could go. We do not even know all of their names. Most of them did not live to see the victory, but without their incredible sacrifice, the escape would have been entirely impossible. Sometimes the most heroic act is not the flight itself. It is the quiet decision to stay in the terrifying shadows, simply to give someone else a fighting chance. Rudolf and Alfred were now completely alone, tightly pressed together in the pitch darkness. It was a space where it is physically impossible to even square your shoulders. You absolutely cannot speak. You can barely breathe. Rudolf slowly closed his eyes. Directly above them was life. He could hear the heavy boots of the armed convoy. He heard the frantic barking of dogs. He heard thousands of prisoners who had absolutely no idea what was happening just a meter beneath their weary feet. In a few short hours, the deafening sirens will wail, and the 72 hours of absolute hell will officially begin. At 17:30, the evening roll call begins. Rudolf and Alfred hear it clearly from inside their wooden grave. Shouted German commands, endless lines of prisoners, the usual grim routine of Auschwitz. But today, the numbers simply will not add up. At 17:45, there is still nothing. Rudolf stares blankly into the impenetrable darkness. He wonders if maybe they did not notice. Could there be a mistake in the counting? Did they somehow forget? By 6 in the evening, there is only a dead silence. This heavy silence is far more terrifying than any noise. It means the furious guards are recounting, double-checking every single line, desperately trying to make sure they did not make a foolish mistake. There is no mistake. At 18:12, the siren finally goes off. It is a piercing, horrific wail that makes the blood of everyone in the camp run completely cold. It is a sound that means only one thing: someone is missing, and the absolute chaos immediately begins. The furious German soldiers aggressively bark orders to search everywhere. They scream to check the barracks, check the sprawling construction site, check every single meter. They know the fugitives could not have gone far. 200 vicious German shepherds are instantly unleashed. Rudolf clearly hears them rapidly scattering across the vast territory. He hears the frantic scratching of sharp claws on the dry earth. He hears the feverish sniffing getting closer and closer to their exact location. They froze completely, not moving a single muscle, scarcely daring to draw a breath. Dogs quickly swarmed directly into the Mexico sector. 5, 6, maybe more. The screaming guards aggressively urged them on, shouting relentless commands. Suddenly, one massive dog breaks away from the frenzied pack. Rudolf distinctly hears its heavy claws scratching violently against the very boards of their fragile shelter. He hears its short, sharp inhalations. The beast moves deliberately along the base of the woodpile. It stops directly above their vulnerable heads. Rudolf hears its every microscopic movement. It is sniffing once, twice, a third time. This is the absolute end, he thinks to himself. They wait in agonizing terror for the signal bark that will instantly end their lives. The massive dog snorts loudly one more time. There is a second of absolute silence. And then, miraculously, comes the sound of retreating paws. Slowly at first, then moving faster away. The strong tobacco and gasoline mixture actually worked. They are miraculously still alive. They are still perfectly hidden. But that was only the very first night. 72 hours of pure agony still lie ahead. And what comes next will be far more terrifying than the dogs. The first night was pure adrenaline and chaos. The loud sirens, the screaming, the dogs. But the second night was absolute silence. And that was infinitely worse. When there is absolutely nothing left to monitor on the outside. You are left completely alone with your own failing body. After 36 hours, without any movement whatsoever, their legs went completely numb. The sensation slowly began to return, and it was pure agony. Severe cramps violently tear at their calves. Their spots are literally pressing into the hard boards, until the boundary between their human flesh and the rough wood completely disappears. You cannot stretch a single limb. You cannot change your agonizing position. Any slight movement is a noise, and any noise is the end of everything. In this claustrophobic darkness, the mind slowly begins to devour itself. What if they actually saw us? What if our brave friends are currently being brutally tortured, and they finally gave us up? Every few hours, heavy boots passed dangerously nearby. Their hearts would completely stop in their chests. Alfred almost never spoke a word. They communicated their sheer terror through simple touch. And then suddenly, heavy boots were not just passing by. They aggressively stopped right at the very edge of the woodpile. A guard aggressively says they have checked everything. Another asks about this specific pile. Maybe they are inside. A voice says it is impossible. The dogs already checked here twice. Dogs make mistakes too, the other voice coldly replies. There is a terrifying silence, and then comes the horrifying sound of heavy wood being violently tossed aside. Rudolf froze completely. Alfred instantly stopped breathing. Their heartbeats quickened to a frantic pace. Do you see anything? No, nothing but solid wood. There is nothing deeper. I told you the dogs would have scented them immediately. They had miraculously survived yet again. Eventually, there was no more barking. No more heavy footsteps. No more screaming German commands. What if they are silently waiting, just outside? Rudolf simply did not know. He had two terrifying paths before him. To remain in this wooden grave forever, or to finally trust the plan. He pressed his shaking palm heavily against the board directly above his head. It slightly gave way. With a much stronger push, a small gap finally opened. It was their very first breath of truly fresh air in 72 grueling hours. Rudolf desperately wanted to sob uncontrollably. This cold air smelled beautifully of damp earth, of distant burning, and of pure freedom. But it was far too early to celebrate their miraculous victory. His battered body would not obey his commands. Muscles that had known absolutely no movement for 3 agonizing days had become complete strangers. Clenching his teeth in pure agony, he violently lunged upward. His bruised shoulders scraped painfully against the rough boards. Rudolf desperately pulled Alfred out of the dark hole. He could barely walk a single step. They were 2 completely broken men, dressed in borrowed civilian suits, standing alone on deeply hostile enemy territory, standing on weak legs that could hardly hold them upright. Ahead of them lay 130 kilometers to Slovakia. They had to travel through heavily occupied Poland without any food, without a single map, with battered bodies that have forgotten exactly how to walk. For 11 grueling nights, they moved only in the pitch darkness. By day, they frantically hid deep in the dense forests. They had absolutely nothing, only the cold stars and their pure survival instincts. Poland was a massive, deadly minefield. German patrols were lurking at every single turn, but incredibly, Rudolf and Alfred finally crossed the Slovak border. 14 agonizing days, running desperately through heavily occupied enemy territory. They had survived the impossible. The plan had actually worked. Now, they would finally deliver the crucial message. They would loudly warn the sleeping world. They would finally stop the death trains. Or so they desperately thought. But the most terrifying part of this entire ordeal still lay ahead. Rudolf furiously dictated for 3 solid days. He accurately drew detailed maps from his memory. He named specific names. He produced a staggering 40-page document known as the Vrba-Wetzler report. It was his ultimate desperate scream to humanity. Hungary is next. 800,000 innocent people are in extreme danger. You must warn them right now. The detailed report was urgently sent to the Vatican and to the Allied forces. And then came the most deafening silence. Weeks of absolutely agonizing silence. Endless negotiations and slow bureaucracy. The politicians safely far away simply said it is too complicated to intervene. Rudolf stood helplessly by the train station in Zelina when he clearly heard that terrifying sound. It was a heavy rumble in the distance, getting closer and closer. And then he saw it with his own eyes. The massive train. Long freight cars with heavily sealed doors. The armed convoy was heading steadily north. He knew exactly this dark route. He had traveled it himself just 2 years ago. The massive train moved slowly. He knew tomorrow another one will come. And the day after that. And the day after that. He could not physically stop these massive trains himself. He could not run up and open the heavy steel doors. He could only stand there and watch in absolute horror. This tragic failure could have easily been the sad end of the story. But miraculously, in June, brave journalists finally printed the leaked report. The BBC bravely broadcasted the horrifying details over the public airwaves. The entire world finally heard the undeniable truth. In the face of massive international pressure, Hungary finally halted the brutal deportations. Rudolf Vrba bravely lived until 2006. Because of his impossible escape, he directly helped save 200,000 innocent lives. Yet until the very end of his long days, he constantly thought only of those he did not manage to save. The horrifying truth is that an evil system relies entirely on your absolute silence. Do not let history repeat its darkest chapters. If this incredible story of ultimate survival and resistance moved you, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and share this video to keep their memory alive. We must never forget.